All right. So on today's agenda, the primary thing is to hear from Leslie Irwin from the county's policy team and Summer as well on how local governments can use ARPA dollars to support sustainability. So Leslie and George and Summer have been kind enough to go through. Angelique, I don't know if you meant to present your screen, but you are. Um, Kind enough to go through the ARPA guidance for the state and local funds and review ways in which they can be used for sustainability purposes and the ways in which they can't a little bit. And then we also collectively went through some of the recommendations that came out of CC4CA, Colorado Communities for Climate Action, and the Colorado Regenerative Recovery Coalition, both of whom put together lists of recommended activities prior to the existence of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or Recovery Plan, or whatever it is, ARPA, whatever ARPA is. And some of those ideas fit and some of those ideas don't. So we went through and looked at, okay, what fits and what doesn't. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then we should have time for questions and updates. Thank you, Leslie. At the end. Anything anybody wants to contribute right off the bat before we dive into it? All right, hearing none, I'm going to share my screen here. All right. So as mentioned, Leslie with Boulder County's policy team is going to take us through this first set of slides here on sort of general ARPA eligibility. And of course, we start off with some disclaimers, and I will let Leslie take it from here, but I would just say, if our lawyers were here, they would say, you know, for any of our partners in other municipalities or other local governments, you need to decide for yourselves and make sure that the use of the funding is eligible on your own, and don't take the county's word for it. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Leslie.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And that's a great disclaimer. I mean, we at the county are reviewing every project for eligibility according to the guidance, looking at Treasury guidance. So, every project should be reviewed that way. In some places, Treasury is very prescriptive and specific about what is eligible and the parameters around eligibility. Sometimes it's a little bit of a gray area, so you really have to work through that, and it's always good to have attorneys in the room as well. So we can move on to the next slide. So there are two tranches of funding, and you'll see those dates there. That's from the Act itself, and the covered period of the funds. So it can be for expenses incurred after March 3rd, as of March 3rd, 2021. And then the deadline to be incurred is that December 31, 2024 date. And the deadline to be fully expended is a couple of years later, primarily for infrastructure projects that might take some time to complete. How Treasury is defining that incurred date is obligated, and the obligated is according to the 2 CFR definition. For the regulatory wonks in the room, which means that the expense, that there's a purchase order or a contract, basically. You have obligated the expense on paper, and that's what we anticipate an auditor would look at. So a purchase order or a contract after March 3rd would be eligible. If it's prior to that, it would not be eligible. The federal goals were, sort of continue addressing the relief needs support recovery efforts, and there's a big transformative piece, transformational piece around especially disproportionately impacted communities around health and economic outcomes, and inequities there, broadband, housing, etc. And let's see, George built this slide deck, so I'm trying to channel George and what he would have said. I'm not sure so much about what this, but everything that you are funding, when you're making your own program parameters, basically, they have to correspond to the needs, and they can't exceed the impact. So you have to connect the impact to the issues. If you're funding something, you need to connect it that there's a negative economic impact to that and be able to prove that and how your funding addresses that problem. There are several places that's written into the Act itself. When you're creating program parameters, you will need to be able to explain how your funding or your program is solving the problem that you've identified.
And Leslie, if I could just chime in here, I
Yeah.
think that this is really important for when we're thinking about, how these funds could be used for sustainability efforts, which is, always coming back to, like, I got lots of ideas on good things to spend money on, but can I tie it to an underlying socioeconomic impact that led to disparate impacts during the pandemic, whether that was economic or health. So that is a key for any of the potential uses of the funding. And then how does that idea then solve that underlying socioeconomic impact? And is the fix proportionate to the problem, right? So
That's right.
So they need to, I can't be, spending millions and millions of dollars on a problem that is only really minor and not a big deal, right?
Right now, how your funding addresses the problem. Treasury, throughout that, they want to see data. So if you're going to go outside or in any gray area, they want a clear explanation. So for example, and kind of getting into the weeds of stuff we'll get to later, but so the disparately impacted funds are clearly eligible in a qualified census tract. But if you're going to serve populations outside of that, that's where Treasury says you need to have data to back up why you're doing that and how what you're doing addresses that impact. So an example with, not necessarily for this group, but an example we're looking at is funding for services, et cetera, for people who are experiencing homelessness. They don't reside in a qualified census tract, but we know there are data about the disparate impacts on homeless populations and their risks, et cetera. And so we will need to be prepared to have a program write-up that has data supporting that and how our funding addresses that. So as an example, a concrete example that we're looking at. Were you going to say something?
Sure. I was just going to point out that this slide has a ton of text on it.
It's kind of just what we just said, though.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And a number of these slides have a ton of text on it. And I hate doing that normally. But there's not really a good way to summarize Treasury guidance without beginning to interpret it. So the slides that are very text heavy in this presentation are more for your reference. Don't feel obligated to read them. We're not going to read them to you. But this is basically just what, as Leslie just said, just what we were talking about. So
yeah, the
you can
data
return to
you
this
can
later.
see in there. This is kind of, what good. I'm glad that this segued well into this slide. Again, this is George's slide deck. Okay, we can move on because I think this would just provide examples when you share it out. So the categories, it looks like something did something funky here with formatting, but that first category, these are eligible uses per the Act. And so there's responding to the public health emergency or its negative economic impacts. That's really one. And then premium pay is another. And then a government can look at their revenue loss, and there's a very prescriptive way, a step-by-step guide for how to calculate that. And then they can use those for government services. They do define that, and we'll talk about that a tiny bit later on. And so you can, capture lost revenue, use it for government services, but the Act specifies what those are. Our budget people are looking at the calculation to see if there's something there. And then there's another category for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And this category was really created to, get at some of those disproportionate impacts, access to broadband, subpar clean water, et cetera. So these don't have to only occur in those neighborhoods, but the category is sort of that transformational piece. And then you can transfer funds to a nonprofit organization or another government. Say if we were going to partner with, just an example that I'm making up, if we were going to partner with the state on broadband, but they wanted to be the lead on it, we could transfer X million dollars to the state and just let them have responsibility for the project. We also can transfer funds for people to provide services for us. That would be a subaward to a subrecipient, which would be slightly different. But for example, if we wanted to give money to the family resource centers, which are like EFA, Our Center, Sister Carmen, to provide services to lower income individuals who had negative impacts from COVID-19, we could subaward to them, slightly different than the transfer of funds, but that's an allowable use. What do we have here? Equitable recovery, systemic challenges, disparate impacts. That's written throughout the rule, the law. It's interesting to read. There's a final rule that some of this is pulled from. It has a lot of data in there. If you're super wonky, it really lays out the case and the impacts and includes a lot of resources in the interim rule itself. But the act's really aimed at getting at some of these disparate impacts that were always there and were really highlighted by the pandemic. Where does sustainability fit in? I think we can move on and then we dive into some examples. Here are some potential uses. So capital improvements in key facilities, that would be more like healthcare settings or their congregate care settings as well. So air quality and ventilation, negative impacts, so small business grants, and you can structure those. You can overlay requirements onto Treasury's requirements. You do have to justify and correlate them. I don't think you can make them up. Treasury has some specific guidance around that, but looking at, grants to small businesses, either tied to the negative economic impact or to help them modify their spaces somehow, for social distancing mitigation. And then there are those infrastructure. Sustainability could appear in there as well, because green infrastructure is allowable. There's some language around parks and, open communal spaces as well. So there could be some things for sustainability in the water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure category as well. And we're going to go a little bit more into all of these categories as well. So assistance to small businesses. So I mentioned a couple of, how that could be structured. So mitigating the financial hardship. So you have to somehow correlate it. With our small business grant that we've had, or we also had nonprofit grants and childcare grants, we did look at revenue loss as a potential use. So they would look year over year, how much revenue is lost, and we gave them money for that. But this also allows to offset with operational costs like payroll. So it's great that that's all spelled out because it wasn't in the CARES Act. So this is a little broader. And then there are those prevention and mitigation tactics as well. And there's also a TA category. That's somewhere sustainability could come in as well, would be helping with business planning for sustainability potentially. Again, you're going to have to correlate it somehow, but that would be potential. That would have some potential. And we could go to the next one.
And just one thing on this, I have utility costs here bolded. One thing that we don't yet know is, does it have to be direct, utility bill payment assistance, or is energy efficiency a support on reducing utility costs? So that, I think, there's a lot of things that fall in the potential eligibility category, and I think that's one.
Yeah, and I see that I saw that Peter, I don't know if he's still on the call from Longmont, has been, raising some concerns about utility assistance and not getting out in the community. The rental assistance does have some utility assistance with it, but Treasury for the rental assistance, separate from the ARPA, specifies what that can be. And it's not really energy efficiency necessarily. It is to pay those bills, although fuel is in there for our wood burning or pellet burning in the mountains people. But yeah, there could be some potential there. And so here's the assistance to household category. You again have to tie the negative impact from COVID somehow. Treasury has guidance around that. It's a little looser than CARES Act because they're recognizing that, we're farther out from the onset of the pandemic. With CARES Act, more people were laid off or underemployed, et cetera. But now they might be getting back employed, but they still need help moving forward. So Treasury is a little bit looser about the nexus and when that nexus occurred than was the CARES Act. But you'll see weatherization there. That is a potential for state sustainability as well. There's very little guidance around that. It just mentions eligibility in the act around weatherization. I think you would have to tie it back to only the households who were disparately negatively impacted from the pandemic. You would have to look at serving those households or doing it in a qualified census tract. That would be a possibility as well, which there's a map later on about that. And then it does talk about, I just mentioned the qualified census tract. There's a whole category of eligible uses for qualified census tracts. That's where there is a higher concentration of lower income people based on census data. And, those are very specific. Again, there's a map in a little bit, but they, to get at those disparate impacts here, some specific eligibility in those qualified census tracts around affordable housing, lead hazards, et cetera. And there was just another mention of the lost revenue. Oh, here's the census tract. So you'll see it's really Boulder, Lafayette, and Longmont. So I'm curious for those communities if they will be looking at doing special programs in those qualified census tracts. And then Treasury has some FAQs with guidance. They update those periodically, but we do look at those and the interim rule for our guidance around eligibility. Let's see what we have here. Equity. So again, a lot of the act is getting help addressing the disproportionate impacts and the inequity in a lot of our systems and access and housing and broadband, et cetera. So that's, again, why the qualified census tract eligibility piece is there.
And I think important here is, and Leslie said this, but in identifying the disproportionately impacted communities, you need to have justification for how the pandemic disproportionately impacted those populations or the geographic areas served.
We can serve outside of those areas. In those mapped areas, they're assumed to be eligible. You're good to go with any of the funding categories for those QCTs, qualified census tracts. But if you're going to serve outside of those, you can. You just need to have data and prove the impacts. And they can be impacts outside of the impacts spelled out in the act, but you just have to really connect them back to COVID, address or communicate how there are disproportionate impacts and how your funding addresses that. And here are some specific eligibility for there as well. So we can pay for staff or other, maybe a nonprofit around community health workers, public benefits navigators. There's that lead paint piece again, and community violence intervention programs. So you can actually pay for people to provide those services. And then you'll see the next one there is the housing, the supportive housing. And so services for people experiencing homelessness and development of affordable housing, which is great. Some services around housing vouchers and relocation. So some eligibility around housing, which is fantastic to see. Educational disparities, that wouldn't be as much for us except for maybe broadband, which is a different category. And then childcare and home visiting programs and child welfare are also eligible. I think the state might have directed some of their funds for child welfare. I'm not entirely positive about that.
Yeah, and when I read through this with a sustainability lens, I think about okay, affordable housing, is solar eligible, for solar on affordable housing units, would that be a qualified use? Or childcare, would increased energy efficiency or retrofits or upgrades to childcare facilities be eligible? So those are things that sort of come to mind when I see this.
Yeah, I mean, the solar, I think yes, the retrofits, you might need to look at that a little bit more and look at the act itself on that and the guidance. There is a lot of eligibility around, well, this is the whole negative economic impact piece. And so this would be funding for workforce development there. There's a lot of job training eligibility, getting unemployed workers or underemployed workers back to work, retraining in different sectors, et cetera. I think the next slide is related to that. I might, here's more on the workforce development. So you can have a back to work incentives. There's the job training piece. And you can also provide sort of ancillary services like childcare assistance to help people get back to work, or assistance with transportation. We haven't looked super closely at that, but that's interesting. And then incentives again. And then there's a public jobs program, subsidized employment piece as well. So a lot around job training. And then I think the next slide might have to do with business startups. And so you can help with business startups as well. So there is a COVID mitigation pieces in there. And then I'm just skimming down if there's any more I want to say about the business startup piece. But you can do job training. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would say here, again, with the sustainability lens, we couldn't just fund, new sustainable startups, right? It needs to be tied to the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. So, in bold there, Leslie's got, the additional cost with starting, the additional cost of, the COVID mitigation tactics for a startup, or the second one is, how did the pandemic make it harder to start up a business now? And there could be some assistance around that for new business startups, with an eye towards looking for more sustainable businesses or more sustainable business practices. But again, that it needs to have that tie. It's not just that, like, well, the economy really suffered, and so we're supporting the economy by supporting new startups. It's no, how are we supporting new startups in a way that addresses the impacts that they faced from the pandemic?
That's right. And Berenice put some ideas in the chat as well. So yeah, looking at how you tailor a program. If you're going to have a job training program or a business startup incentive program, how can you tailor that? And you would, again, have to look at the guidance for the guidance on that. Here's an interesting piece that I really like around outdoor spaces. So you can improve outdoor spaces. And so there is, I bolded some down there. Investments in parks, public plazas, public outdoor recreation spaces, to promote healthier living environments. And then there is a piece for small businesses and their outdoor spaces, and also facade improvements to improve the built environment for the economic piece. And then that final one is around increased use of parks. So we have seen increased use, and do we need to have signage or mitigation at parks somehow? So that would be eligible under that category. And here's that infrastructure category. But first, here it talks about, so water, sewer, and broadband are that's the infrastructure category. This is saying, could we use it for infrastructure other than that? And so you could use it, so that a minute ago I mentioned the lost revenue piece, and you can use it for, if you capture lost revenue, use it for general government services. You could use for maintenance and pay-go spending for new infrastructure from that category. And then, or you could tie somehow to the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. That would be a little, you'd really need to look at that, but they provide an example there about investments in facilities for the delivery of vaccines. The nexus would have to be really tight, because there's this other very prescriptive infrastructure category around water, sewer, and broadband. So if you're going to go outside of that, you need to really closely examine that.
And I put this one in here, specifically thinking about, okay, what about, bike lanes or EV charging stations or things like that. And they, as I understand it, are pretty challenging to find a way to fit in, particularly something like an EV charging station. a bike lane or a bike path, could go back to that parks piece on the last slide. But, it's hard I haven't yet come up with a creative way of how the pandemic made access to EV charging, something that's harder, or maybe it's a part, maybe it fits in with affordable housing. Maybe that's how that fits
Yeah,
in.
the housing infrastructure, yeah.
Yeah. But I know, we've gotten some questions on, certainly around EV charging already, and that's a tough one.
Yeah, the nexus needs to be pretty tight.
Yeah.
Very tight, I would say. And then here's other eligibility around specific industries, the impacted industries. And again, Treasury looked at data, and these were the most impacted in their view: travel, tourism, and hospitality. And so you can pay for safe reopening, so whatever that looks like, distancing, mitigation, etc. And then if you had a planned expansion or upgrade prior to the pandemic that got put off, you could use funds for that as well. Now, I think is it the next slide says that if can we go outside of those industries? Again, you would just have to have really strong data, and they provide their examples like, look, we looked at this data to identify these industries. If you're going to go outside of this, you really need to have data supporting it, and again, tying it to the negative economic impact very strongly. So you can go outside of those industries, but you're really going to have comparable data with those industry impacts and be able to prove it.
And I think here about the nexus of, going back to the, socioeconomic, conditions, right? What happened to the cleaning industry, during the pandemic? I don't honestly know. But, was there a disparate impact on that industry? And could we, as, sustainability professionals and folks interested in sustainability, help them with assistance with more, sustainable, I think about or landscaping, maybe would be a better example. Would electric, string trimmers and leaf blowers be eligible? I think we would need to really be able to show that there was a negative economic impact to that industry.
And how those things help them, how those specific funded items address that negative economic impact.
Totally. Yeah. And thank you so much, Leslie, for saying that, because that's something that, like, it can't be just the one, right? It's got to be the two, right?
That's right.
There has to be the impact, and your solution has to address that impact. It can't just be, well, this was an impacted industry, so we can do things that are beneficial to them. No, the beneficial thing has to address that negative impact directly.
That's right.
All right. So shall I take it from here, Leslie?
Yeah, thank you all so much. I think we're going to have time for questions afterwards as well. And I do want to recognize Peter, and there might be others on the call as well who, are in the weeds on this stuff as well. So I hope that Peter will chime in if I misspoke about anything, or if he has anything to add, and others who might be experts in this area as well.
Oh, so I think I'll just say I think you did a really good job of running through that. I think that's a really good high-level overview of exactly how the Act works. I think the only things that I would caution about are based on my experience and knowledge of this so far, are the infrastructure pieces. I've been paying attention to the conversations at the national level with how the infrastructure parts are working, and particularly when it comes to things like broadband, there's a lot of concerns about how to make that work and how that would work in the bigger picture. So just as long as everyone knows that there's still a lot of discussion around how to make the infrastructure pieces work. I think, Leslie, I think you hit all the nails on the head on the presentation. So I think that was great.
Thanks, Peter. And that does remind me, though, so Treasury does have some guidance about broadband. You have to increase the Mbps or whatever it's called, and it's pretty prescriptive. And I hear some of those pieces are hard to navigate. And then just to say on the water piece, they're also very prescriptive. So anything that would be eligible under the EPA's drinking water, I forget the acronym. There's a Drinking Water Act and a Clean Water Act. And so programs that would be eligible under those EPA programs are eligible under ARPA, and that's it. So you look at those EPA programs for that water and sewer eligibility, and then you look at the Act for the broadband eligibility, which, as Peter says, is challenging to navigate.
Great, thank you. And the FAQs that we, pulled snippets out of, we have the link at the bottom of this presentation, and I'll put it in the chat. It is getting updated almost weekly, looks like, or sometimes daily. So, for example, since Leslie and George gave me this presentation a week and a half ago, there's a whole new section there that made it into this presentation that wasn't there when they first gave me the overviews. So things are changing and being more clearly defined as time rolls along. So speaking of which, so the next section here in the presentation covers the ideas that came out of the Colorado Communities for Climate Action and Regenerative Recovery Coalitions, both sort of memos or white papers, if you will, on, hey, we know there's going to be recovery funds at the end of this thing. Here are some sustainability focused ideas and ways to spend those funds. And Leslie and George Twig at the county have generously gone through all of those ideas and labeled them as, if they are potentially ARPA eligible. And again, big caveat here, each jurisdiction needs to ensure eligibility for themselves. And then I rank them on a strategic score, which is just my own opinion of, does this address equity? It got 1 point if it did. Is this, something that we can implement in the next 2 years, or does it have a long, super long lead time to bring it up to speed? So it got a point if it was sort of shovel ready. It got a point if it was something that would address large scale systems change versus being fairly limited. And I gave it, there was one other factor that I'm blanking on right now, that are our department's priorities, and I've forgotten one of them. That's embarrassing. So anyhow, I think there was a total of 4 points they could earn in my sort of score, just to sort of give a little bit of delineation of like, okay, there's a, if we look at the lists on the ideas on this list, clearly investing in affordable housing as a higher value project than replacing stovetops, right? And so that's where affordable housing gets the score of 3, the stovetops gets a score of 1.5. So again, these next slides are also quite text heavy, but I really wanted them there for your reference. And I'm not going to read you all of the text on the slide here, but just talk about some of the top things that sort of rose out of, what is potentially ARPA eligible, and, from a programmatic standpoint, from an impact standpoint, what seems like it's rising to the top for something that we may all want to consider. So affordable housing, I think that was one. Workforce training for labor shortages, particularly around, I think about electrification and the need for skilled professionals in the HVAC trade to really go out and sell and install heat pumps. Weatherization, of course, hits definitely on the equity front is strongly important, and addresses those socioeconomic conditions that led to disparate impacts. So those 3 sort of stood out for me in the buildings category. On circular economy, there wasn't a lot that made it through the cut of what was on the idea list from CC4CA and from the Colorado Regenerative Recovery Coalition, and what was actually ARPA eligible. Potentially support for circular economy businesses, but again, it really needs to be tied to that economic harm or the disproportionate impacts, which you're going to need to do some more thinking about to figure out exactly what that connection is there. So at this point, it seems like it's a little hard to find eligible uses that address, zero waste, waste diversion, circular economy, et cetera. Farmers and food systems, there was a lot that made it through here. Certainly, grants for Black, Indigenous, people of color farmers, and could be tied to supporting regenerative agriculture practices. Agriculture, workforce development, that's another one. Some of the like community supported agriculture is interesting. Again, needs to be tied to that disproportionate impact. So is it a subsidy for households experiencing food insecurity to be able to participate in community supported agriculture? I think that's a really neat idea to potentially explore. Food waste prevention. Yes, if it is ultimately feeding families experiencing food insecurity, not just, just cutting down waste at businesses. So like, again, there needs to be that tie. It's like, it's a little tough for me to tease out like, but this is just a good thing. And we're supposed to, this funding should go to good things. It's like, no, it needs to be a good thing. And it needs to be tied to the disproportionate impacts from COVID-19. Looking at labor and communities.
Boulder County, workforce Boulder County, Aaron Johns.
Does someone want to say something? Cool. Okay. Labor and communities, there's a lot here as well. Again, there's a lot of language, specifically around workforce development. So, and technical assistance, as Leslie pointed out. So, programs that facilitates a business's ability to implement sustainability practices and that sort of technical assistance, potentially, if it's for small businesses. That's not something we really covered earlier, but the language says a lot about small businesses and prioritizing them. I think it would be harder to do something like this, and for a larger business, I don't even know if it would be eligible. Let's see. Leslie talked about the ability to fund organizations to do this work, whether that's chambers of commerce or, I saw Dan and Sharon were on here. Certainly I would think the SBDC's work for small businesses would largely be eligible in a lot of ways, and around sustainability, and what is the SBDC doing around sustainability for supports for businesses. You and I are already having that conversation, so I think this is another reason to continue that. Workforce training for sustainability jobs, we kind of covered that, but again, I think there it needs to be. It can't be workforce training for Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, but it can't just be, the workforce training has to be targeted to a population that it was disproportionately impacted, right? It can't just be, gosh, well, I'd love to go to a new conference, right? There needs to be that connection, right?
That's correct. You have to have the nexus there.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so moving on.
I was just going to mention one thing about workforce training, just that the state did also invest some funding directly that's going to be available for workforce centers, and this reskilling and upskilling category is pretty clear it's eligible. And to your point, if it's for people who were unemployed due to the pandemic, the categories are pretty broad in terms of what that upskilling and reskilling services can be. As long as it's assisting the people that lost employment during the pandemic. Does that make sense? So they're also, I think, with workforce, Boulder County and the state workforce development services groups are looking at is really what are some of the big gap areas in the state and how we're investing in helping to reskill folks in those areas.
Yeah, thanks, Summer. And I just noted another one on here, include sustainability criteria in any future small business grants. That's a potential. Again, we got to walk that line of like, what is the connection there? But it's something that sort of an early idea that I had, and something that I think the county did and others did in the original CARES Act grants as well. So that's a sort of another lens of going about this is, it's not just the program itself is the only thing that can factor in sustainability in terms of what it is that the program is trying to do, but can we imbue, our existing programs, like, for example, if you're hiring for, some broadband work to be done, right? Like, can you put on some sustainability, requirements into that contract or that bid, right? I think that's another way of going about it is, probably a fair amount of this money is going to be leaving, the county to contractors and subcontractors and to cities, from cities to contractors and subcontractors as well. And so, with this, this funding leaving our organizations, looking at what are our requests around sustainability to be eligible to bid or, in that contract, I think is another way to go about it. But would require analysis to make sure it's eligible. Transportation, sort of like we talked about here with the infrastructure, there's not a lot that really sort of made it through the cut on what's ARPA eligible. I think, parks infrastructure in parks, particularly in qualified census tracts or serving qualified census tract residents, or, something else that you could point to that it's serving disproportionately impacted populations. So here are some other things that have come up for us as we've been thinking about it and discussing it that weren't necessarily in the list of CC4CA recommendations or the list of regenerative recovery recommendations, but certainly low-income weatherization is clearly called out. So that definitely caught our eye. I already covered utility bill assistance. Is that, does that need to be payment of utility bills, or can that be energy efficiency upgrades? I think that's a question mark. Sustainability requirements for any small business grants, just talked about that. Efficiency for solar for affordable housing, cover that. Technical business sustainability planning assistance, Leslie and I both talked about that. The childcare business support, I'm thinking about energy efficiency for childcare facilities there again. And then we had asked Leslie and George, can program marketing, program outreach, and program staff be an eligible expense? And yes, but it must be tied to an eligible program, right? So if it's part of, you're doing a weatherization program, which is clearly eligible, then, part of doing that weatherization program is you need to market it, right? And so like that would be eligible. Or if you need to hire a staff person to manage that weatherization program, that could be eligible. But, hiring a new sustainability manager not tied to, an eligible program, not going to cut it. So if you've enjoyed this presentation, here are the links. And I'll put these in the chat once I get out of this presentation as well, and I'll send this presentation around. But particularly the fact sheet, or the FAQ rather, this same link works. They just keep updating it, and they're really good about notating what the new changes are that they've added in over time. So that's a good place to go back to. And final thoughts here is, the same Treasury rules apply, broadly speaking, correct me anybody if I'm mistaken here, to the state, the counties, the cities and towns. And so, one of the reasons we wanted to give this presentation today was to give us all, put us all on sort of the same page and thinking about, gosh, well, if, City of Longmont's going to do a weatherization program, and Boulder County's looking at doing a weatherization program, and, Lafayette's looking at doing a weatherization program, would it make sense to have that conversation together and pool our resources into one thing, or versus like all doing it all independently and in silos and taking extra time to duplicate efforts, which is something that I greatly dislike. So something to think about, maybe not so much today, but in the future is, how do we stay in the loop on this, on what our jurisdictions are thinking about, what ideas are our jurisdictions thinking about. I don't know that at the county we really have narrowed down this list. This is, I think, sort of one step of the process is getting that CC4CA and regenerative recovery list vetted past Leslie and George to begin to think about, okay, what's possible, and then what is strategic is another question. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over for questions from the group.
Hey, Zach, this is Tom. I just occurred to me that from the workforce development standpoint, I think an organization, a nonprofit organization like Grid Alternatives might be a good example of somebody who has a program that targets lower income individuals, families with job training for design, development, installation of solar projects. And so that might be something like that might be a nice fit for this, if I understood that correctly.
Yeah, Tom, that's a good that's a really good point. And Peter, I saw your point in the chat as well. Totally supportive of that. I'm not in those meetings. I'm guessing maybe you are. I know I believe Summer you are too. Is that something that you guys could bring there?
That's something that I've been thinking about. I think I'm attending the next one, which is either tomorrow. Let me just check my calendar really quick. Oh, yes, it's tomorrow afternoon, and I think sustainability topics are kind of at the tip of our tongue here in Longmont. We're still working on exactly what our spending plan will be. I think one of the key pieces that's on my mind is just making sure that we have some kind of strategic view for the local area on how we're going to spend our funds. I think affordable housing is a really interesting target for most of us. So trying to figure out some way to create a more cohesive system maybe would be a good idea, but I think that would be more up to the agency administrators, people like Harold and your, everyone on the call, city managers and everything, to try to figure out exactly how we should spend that fund. So anyway, I hope that's helpful, but I think the agency administrators would be a good one to continue this and carry over to.
Yeah.
I wanted to build off of that, Zach, that, we were going to have this conversation kind of preliminarily, just brainstorming with our economic vitality partners. But I want to note, just thinking about the agency administrators and the overall, what Peter, you said, the strategic plan about investing these dollars, that this might be a really preliminary conversation, because at the county, we are hiring a planning contractor to help us with just gathering input from all these different sources, this group and many, many others, community members themselves, other regional partners and state partners, et cetera, since there are so many different eligible uses. So just want to note that that is something the county is doing, as well as partnering with the Community Foundation of Boulder County for some of the kind of community engagement processes. And so there's more to come that I know that will be shared out probably at those agency administrator meetings in the future. But just want to note that there's a lot of, as we know, a lot of activity and a lot of planning and discussions about this, but I still think it's important to have these conversations. And I know, Leslie, you had your hand up as well.
I was going to chime in about the state. The state has directed a lot of money to certain areas out of their American Rescue Plan dollars, and some general fund dollars from the state as well. And they have these interim groups working through, I think, October to provide recommendations, spending plans for those dollars. One area is housing. So, for me, my recommendation would be kind of wait and see what the state does with, what their plan is for their housing dollars. It's hundreds of millions of dollars over the next few years. I forget how much, but hundreds of millions of dollars directed to housing. Childcare is another area they directed money. Summer mentioned workforce. So behavioral health is another biggie. They directed a lot of money to behavioral health. So it'll be interesting to see, what the state plan is, and then to dovetail whatever we do to complement or fill in gaps, based on whatever the state does. That would be my thinking around that.
Really great point. Yeah. Angelique.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I don't know exactly where these points fit in the overall conversation, whether they are relevant to this funding opportunity or maybe the future. But there are a couple of things that we really took away as Good Business Colorado from our discussions with folks during the legislative session. And one of them is that restaurants and retail are really, really struggling to get staff. They can't, they just can't find people. And part of that, well, anyway, there's lots of reasons, which I'm sure we all, could talk about. But one that I think is important to focus on is the idea that people are, have realized maybe they don't want to work for poverty wages anymore. So, I think that being able to bring our hospitality, our restaurants in particular, and retail back to where they were pre-pandemic is addressing this issue from a larger, more systemic point of view. It's not just, oh, they can make more money because of the unemployment benefits, and when those go away, they'll come back to work. I don't know. I don't think that's true. And besides which, restaurants are going under every day because they can't find the staff to to operate. And I also think that it's really important that Anise mentioned this, that the restaurant revitalization funds, there were a bunch of awardees whose awards were canceled or suspended or whatever you want to call it because of the lawsuits around directing those funds toward minority and women-owned businesses. And, these are businesses in our community that were awarded funds, have made plans for those funds, maybe even hired on staff, and now they don't have the funds to pay the people that they hired if they manage to find people to hire. And this is critical. How are we gonna, what are they supposed to do? So I think that's something for us to keep in mind as well. And finally, in terms of what qualifies as clean jobs, I think that what we've heard from places like Pueblo was that the idea that people are going to replace their jobs at Comanche with jobs in the solar industry is not flying in that community at all. And I think that what might be a more successful strategy would be to do some convening and hear from the workers in those communities. What do you want your future to look like? What kinds of jobs do you want in your community for your kids? And they may not be what we think of traditionally as clean jobs, but they are still clean jobs in that they are replacing extractive industry jobs and enabling those communities to actually do transition into other areas that maybe aren't, quote unquote, clean tech or green jobs per se. So that's my idea dump.
Thank you for that, Angelique. I just wanted to follow up with you to let you know that so many of the partners of this group are part of we call the Regional Economic Vitality partners, and we really should have you a participant in that group. We work together over the last year and a half to respond to small business and larger industry needs as a collaborative between the cities and towns in Boulder County and the chambers and other associations. So I would invite you to that meeting, and also wonder if we could follow up and talk a little bit about that local small business support. We have a project out to survey small businesses, but right now we're touching base with many of the organizations to see how they're doing. Because Boulder County and many of the cities and towns on this call, did direct small business grants outside of PPP and EIDL and federal and state programs. And we did a grant altogether, $1.9 million of small business assistance with the state's funding just in December, January. And we've been trying to take the temperature of what may be needed now. So would love to follow up with you on that. Okay.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank Leslie and Summer for their insights and joining us on this call today. I promised we have time for updates. We got 2 minutes left. Does anyone have any updates that they want to share regarding business sustainability happenings in your area? Cool.
Zach, this is Renee. Sorry. Just a quick, how to start your sustainability team event, July 21st. I'm going to put the link on the chat. Thank you.
Awesome. Yep. And we've got that in our newsletter going out, Barry. It'll go out this afternoon. So we're excited about that. I think it'd be a good thing for others to share as well. And it's bilingual, I believe. Is that right, Bernice?
Yes, it's going to be bilingual. Thank you for that reminder.
Awesome. Cool. Well, super interesting discussion. I'm excited to continue it. I don't think anyone has. There's no like, okay, here's what we're doing after today, right? Like, there's still a lot more thinking to put into this and a lot more collaboration and strategizing. And I think Peter had a great comment in the chat about how much of this is this funding going to be tied up into sort of ongoing expenses in responding to the pandemic, and what's left over, and then what is the most strategic use of that in is it in regards to tying it into existing plans and that our jurisdictions already have in place. And so I think that's a level of analysis that would be good to come next. So I will get this recording posted and then shared, and I'll send out the slides and look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone. Take care and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.